Olá a todos, sejam muito bem-vindos à FGV, sejam muito bem-vindos à EBAPE. Eu sou o professor Bernardo Fajardo, coordenador da graduação em Administração da EBAPE, e tenho o prazer de estar aqui hoje moderando esse webinar com a professora Ingrid Schneider. Webinar esse que tem o tema Can Digital Platforms be Democratically Regulated? Esse evento está sendo transmitido pelo YouTube, ao vivo, e pelo LinkedIn também. Vale reforçar que as manifestações expressas por mim e pela professora Ingrid não representam necessariamente a posição institucional da FGV e que ambos concordamos em participar desse evento de forma espontânea e que autorizamos o uso da nossa imagem para transmissão. Lembrando também, reforçando que esse webinar ficará disponível para todos nos canais oficiais da FGV. O webinar será em inglês e sem transmissão simultânea. Mas uma coisa que eu sempre gosto de reforçar é que não sejam tímidos, façam as suas perguntas a qualquer momento usando a plataforma Slido. O link está aqui embaixo, né, disponível na descrição do YouTube. É só clicar ali e fazer a sua pergunta, que no final a professora Ingrid irá responder as perguntas realizadas por vocês. Certo? Primeiro, então, só para organizar a lógica do nosso webinar, primeiro a professora fará uma exposição de 40 minutos, em torno de 40 minutos, e depois a gente fica com o restante do tempo para perguntas. Agora eu vou trocar a chavinha rapidinho e introduzir a professora Ingrid. Hello, Professor Ingrid. Welcome to FGV. Welcome to EBAPE. It's a great pleasure to have you here to share with us the results of your researches on this so interesting and innovative topic. I've just explained in Portuguese. You have around 40 minutes to your lecture, and then we go to the questions of the audience. Okay?
Okay, thank you very much. So I hope you can now see my slides.
Okay, just 1 minute. I have to introduce you properly. Professor Ingrid Schneider is Professor of Political Science in the Center Ethics and Information Technology at University of Hamburg in Germany. And with FGV, she is part of an European Union funded project, Prodigies, a research initiative on the digitalization of business and countries towards sustainable development. So, Professor Ingrid, thank you. The floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Bernardo. I hope you can see me and also see my slides. So I would first like to thank you very much for this kind invitation. I feel very much honored. And I would like to introduce first the project you already mentioned. It's called Prodigies, Promoting Research on Digitalization and Emerging Powers and Europe Towards Sustainable Development. Can you see my slide? Hello?
Yeah, it's working.
It's working. Okay. So, this project has received funding from the European Union, and it's for 4 years. We just got it a little bit extended right now because of the COVID crisis. And we have 11 partners involved from Germany, from Italy, from Vienna, from Austria, from Indonesia, South Africa, Mexico, and Brazil. So the Fundação Getulio Vargas is part of our project, and also India is part of our project. And what we are doing is, let me see whether I can do the next slide. Yeah, these are the project partners, and you can also get some information on Prodigies on the website. If you just do this website. And our aims are transnational knowledge sharing on digitalization and sustainability, to know a little bit better what are the positive effects of digitalization in terms of economic and social growth, social welfare, more transparency, improved governmental services, and also the penetration of financial services, and how potential negative effects can be mitigated by replacing labor, for instance, because digitalization might also increase inequalities between urban and rural areas or power asymmetries between states and digital platforms. So we will engage in innovative transnational training and multi-stakeholder dialogues, and the FGV are part of this. So we want to identify and promote policy paths that are more likely to maximize benefits for the achievement of the sustainability development goals as well. So we also include network activities. We had a kickoff workshop. We have a website and a newsletter, to transnational open access trainings and policy labs, and we will have a final conference. And I hope you will join us in further meetings and also other forms of exchanges. Our main research areas are governance and society and economy and environment. And as you can see, I already did a so-called secondment. So in 2020, I spent 2 months in Mexico City. And I'm planning another secondment for 2.5 months at the beginning of next year in Rio at FGV, and I'm looking very much forward to that. And the research area is shaping digitalization, governance, and society. And my special topic is platform and platform regulation, because in Europe we are talking very much now about platforms, digital platforms, and their power. And we have set into place the so-called general data protection regulation and also other forms of regulating platforms. And I'm very much interested to know a little bit more about what Brazilians think about platform regulation. And I will do comparative and interdisciplinary research. We'll talk with experts, but also do participatory observation of events. And I would also like to get to know some digital rights organizations. So let me start a little bit to our topic. How is digitalization transforming society and the economy? And I would like to start with some illustrative pictures, because as you know, digitalization is today penetrating all spheres of social life, from cradle to grave, so to speak, and sometimes even before birth. So people looking at their screens seem to be similar in many countries, social milieus and cultures. People enjoy it as nice, convenient, often very much entertaining. So this is a picture from Mexico I took last year. And maybe your kitchen table looks similar to this picture. I sometimes also have difficulties to keep my children from watching their screens and watching us face to face when we are united at the kitchen table. And you may also recognize this maybe in Rio on the beach, but it might be similar that people interact with other people who are not at the same time in the same round of people. So there's a lot of communication taking place with our cell phones right now. And of course, even though all of this is perceived as communication, it's also, it requires a lot of infrastructure in the background. And it's also on the same time associated with lots of data collections, personal data collections, but also sensitive data, behavioral data, because your location is also tracked when you use a cell phone via GPS tracking. And it's also about societal data, which can be aggregated. So there is more and more data which is stored every day, which is streamed every day. And even though it all seems to be virtual, in reality, there is also a materiality of data. And these are data server farms, so-called server farms, and they They store the data, they also collect the data, and they help us to interact with each other. This is how they look like, and they are not necessarily on Brazilian soil or on German soil. And even if you say you store data in the cloud, for instance, your photos, the server farm may be in Georgia, in the US, or in other places, and thus they are also subjected to the jurisdiction of this country. So this might matter if you have some complaints, because then you have to go to the Californian court or to the court of the United States. Big data nowadays is very often called the most valuable resource, and it's very much often compared to oil. I'm not sure whether this metaphor is the best one, but maybe in terms of platform, it's a very nice metaphor, because you know that these large platforms are very powerful. And nowadays we also talk a lot about artificial intelligence, which in general can be defined as a technology which automatically detects patterns in data and makes predictions on the basis of them. And this is done by machine learning. Machine learning are very complex programs that are trained by large amounts of data, and often not even the software developers know what patterns are detected and what's the relationship between the input and the output of a system. So therefore, there is also a lot of talk now about black boxing, that the machine learning is a black box and we cannot look into it. So the question is whether the outcome is biased when it comes to social inequalities, for instance, with gender and other forms. And the question is whether we can trust artificial intelligence, and whether who is to take responsibility and liability if something goes wrong. And whether, if we cannot look into the black box, whether we can trust it in terms of taking decisions by these machine learning systems, or whether the machine is replacing us. And then the question of liability, of course, is still a very urgent one. So when it comes to big data, some years ago, there was this cover story by the MIT Technology Review, which says big data will save politics. But only 5 years later, the cover story said technology is threatening our democracy. How do we save it? So there seems to have been a huge shift in the perception of big data and of digital platforms. So I will talk now a little bit about the bright and the dark sides. And of course, one of the opportunities of big data and of digital platform is that they allow each of us to communicate with almost every other person on the planet. So it's not just like radio or TV who are gatekeepers, but radio and TV are very often now described as one-to-many communication, but now there is many-to-many communication in terms of everyone being able to be a sender to the others. So in theory, this is broadening the public sphere, and it fosters free speech, freedom of expression, and attention can be gained by everyone. So some political scientists said this is a huge opportunity to move from the spectator to the participatory democracy. And social media can be a form of mobilization and also of democratization of a society. So, but these were dreams and utopias. In reality, you might also know, especially in Brazil, that there is a lot of fake news, which was also spread via platforms such as Facebook, but also WhatsApp, which favored also the election of Jair Bolsonaro. And you might also know, at least in many countries, there are many conspiracy theories about COVID-19 which are spread. And this is also not only a pandemic, but also an infodemic very often taking place. when it comes to fake news about vaccines and things like that. So this might be seen as the dark side of platform economy and of social media. And of course, even though in theory, everyone can gain attention and can communicate with everybody else, our resources in terms of attention are scarce and are limited. So the question is, what is getting more attention? And of course, emotion creates more attention than real facts, and especially negative affections like indignation, like outrage, drive more engagement in terms of Twitter responses or responses on Facebook and Instagram than positive emotions. So what's happening is that there are escalations of mostly negative engagement, such as shitstorms. And also in many countries, we see more polarization between different segments of society, and more radical voices are even more radicalized. So in terms of the public sphere, there is a lot of fragmentation of the public sphere now taking place. Quality newspapers are losing coverage, and many people just listen to other people who have the same opinion or a similar opinion. So there's a lot of talk today about so-called filter bubbles or echo chambers, who only magnify a certain spectrum of perspectives or a certain spectrum of opinions. So in terms of the public sphere, there is now more a negative attention to many aspects of it. And if you don't take care, this might lead to more social polarization and people not being able to find consensus or even to speak with people with a different opinion anymore. In that respect, I think all of us have to learn more, have to gain more media competencies, more digital literacy, and also behave politely with each other in social media. So the so-called netiquette is certainly a form of civil attitude we all have to learn. I would now like to turn to some opportunities and challenges in AI and big data and just give you some snapshots about it. So you might have heard about the so-called GAFA companies and their platform power. And GAFA stands for Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon. And of course, you know that these platforms are the most powerful ones, and they are, so to speak, soaking up lots of data about everyone in the world, about all of ourselves. And these characteristics of digital platforms can be, in a nutshell, say that these enable two or more sides to interact. So it's customers, advertisers, and service providers. But in economic terms, they produce so-called network effects. So the more users you have, the more valuable is the platform. So, and if the platform is already attracting more users, others will also use this platform and not another one. So you can see this if you have a telephone and you have another person also having a telephone, it will be magnified, the effect will be magnified the more people have access to telephones. And the same is true, of course, for platforms as well. So there is a process of monopolization or even oligopolization. So most people use, for instance, Google as a search engine, or use Facebook or Instagram for messaging services, because it's easier and because their friends and relatives are on the same platform. In terms of financing, platforms often use cross-subsidization. So one arm of the company provides a service for free, for instance, search, or for instance, messaging, and another arm creates revenues to make up for these losses, which is very often they sell advertisements. And the rules of service and product development are set by the platform owner. In that respect, Nick Srinichev, who wrote a book about platforms, says that platforms embody a politics as they not only gain access to data, but also control and governance over the rules of the game. So the rise of digital platforms comes along with disruptive new business models. The app revenue models rely on tracking online activity and on selling ads. And the value chains from data and big data analytics become a source of power for these large platforms. And the network effects I already tried to explain to you lead to digital monopolies. And if you have an idea about the value of those platforms, just have a look at the market value. So Microsoft, Apple, and Google each are now more valuable than $1 trillion US. And if you see the little boxes here, you can see that they really are more valuable in terms of market value than any other company in the world, like oil, finance, or healthcare companies. So, and there's also, in terms of geographical distribution, most of these platforms are in the United States, or China has its own platforms. There are hardly any large platforms in Europe and in Latin America, which has also geostrategic implications. So nowadays, many people talk about a new rivalry in terms also of technical supremacy. So some people say it's just the US and China, and the rest of the world is squeezed between these models and has to make a decision which model to follow. Other people say, no, we have not to choose between those models, but to develop our own model. And for instance, in Europe right now, there's a lot of talk about a new narrative and paving a so-called third way in between, or as an alternative to the Chinese and the US model. So let's talk a little bit more about the Chinese model. You might heard about that. China has its own platforms, but also a so-called social credit system. And the Chinese platforms are Baidu, WeChat, and Alibaba. Alibaba is similar to Amazon, and WeChat is a messenger service like WhatsApp. And China's search engine is Baidu, which is similar to Google. In China also, there's a tight collaboration between the platforms and the state, and China is very active also when it comes to cameras, to CCTV cameras in public places, and also facial recognition. So China wants to install a nationwide so-called social credit system. As far as now, it's only pilot systems which have been tried out and are tried out in some places like in Rongcheng, in Shanghai, and other parts of the country. But its aim is to have a general nationalized system. And the idea is that all the data about the behavior of people are somehow summarized as a so-called individual social score. So in that respect, everyone starts with, let's say, 700 points on a scoring. And if you are doing good deeds, you will get plus points, and you will get deductions if you do something which does not correspond to what's seen as positive. So if you pay your taxes right in time, if you adhere to traffic rules, if you pay your bills correctly, if you act upon court judgments, that's positive. But also if you obey to the family planning limits, if you visit and care for your parents, all that is part of the score. And also a third measure is interaction with other internet users. So if you criticize the government, you will receive deductions in scores. And if you interact with friends with low scores, this will also negatively affect your own score. And a lot of shopping, however, charity work, donating money or blood will increase your score. So in terms of output, a high or a low score will affect also social opportunities like eligibility of loans, whether your children can have access to high school, whether you can have a good public job as a public servant, and whether you can travel. So there are blacklists for people with low score and red lists for people with high scores. There are reports also that 17 million Chinese people with a low score were banned from buying flights, and more than 5 million people were also prevented from traveling in high-speed trains. As it seems, there are high approval rates for Chinese citizens for this score system, but in the Western world, it's very much seen as a big brother state, as a digital totalitarian state. And some people say that China aims at a form of digital panopticon. You might know this. This is a prison system where all the prisoners are in their own cells, and it's the guardian who can watch all of them. So everyone is subjected to a centralized form of social control and also internalize this control in terms of self-control. So this is the Chinese model. Let's have a look at the United States digital platform model. The US model of digital capitalism is characterized by high venture capital investments, low regulation, and a so-called Californian ideology. So the German magazine Der Spiegel already declared the Silicon Valley companies and CEOs to be the new world government. And there is a quote from Eric Schmidt, the executive chairman of Alphabet Google, the former one, who said, "What gives those platforms power is their ability to grow, specifically their speed to scale, and almost nothing short of a biological virus can scale as quickly, efficiently, or aggressively as these technology platforms, and this makes the people who build, control, and use them powerful too." So all these platforms have gained a lot of market value, and it's rising and rising. And they are now, as already said, the largest companies in the world and the most rich companies in the world as well. So the journal Economist said that these platforms have gained an alarming concentration of economic and political power. And of course, power is also expressed in dominant operating systems. For instance, Android is the main operating engine in all over Latin America. And of course, these platforms try to maintain their power, so they also try to buy up smaller players. So big fish is eating the small fish, so to speak. So Facebook, for instance, acquired WhatsApp. Google acquired Motorola. Microsoft acquired Skype. So there is a lot of concentration taking place also by these mergers or acquisition of smaller players. And these social apps have monthly users, which are more than 2 billion. So to speak, we can say that Facebook is the biggest country in the world when it just comes to inhabitants or users. It's more like any nation state in terms of people using it. And Facebook also owns WhatsApp and Instagram. So many of these messenger services and social media also belong to Facebook, which is a lot of concentration also in terms on behalf or in the hands of Mark Zuckerberg, so to speak. So the business model of these social networks has two priorities. One is growth and the other priority is monetization. So to achieve these priorities and these goals is that they want users to stay online as long as possible. And the longer they stay online, the longer they can also click on ads. And this is how these platforms make money. So the measure for those platforms for their success is visits, hits, and clicks. And they are not at all taking a lot of interest in deciding what's truthful or what's original or what's rational. They are very indifferent to that. And so there is hardly any separation between facts and opinions like in traditional newspapers. So some people say we already live in a post-truth era. And these platforms, what they also do is they profile users. This is very useful, of course, for selling ads because they want to know, for instance, what are your interests, whether you are more interested in sports or you are more interested in nature and things like that. So all the preferences of users are profiled, and they can be profiled with a very high prediction accuracy. So there are some people saying or made studies, for instance, Michael Kosinski, who says with just some 70 clicks, Facebook will know about you as well as a close friend. And with 150 likes, Facebook will recognize you and know about you as well as your parents. And with 300 likes, even as much as your spouse. So they can tell what's your gender, what's your sexual orientation, what's your political orientation, whether you are Christian or belong to another religion, whether you smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol, whether you use drugs, whether you are single or in a relationship, and even they claim to know, at least with a 60% prediction accuracy, whether your parents were still together at age 21. So this might sound a bit frightening to you, but of course, this is very much used in marketing. And I think you might even be aware as marketing students of the so-called Big Five, which are personality preferences and traits, and personalities are very often characterized along these Big Five, the so-called ocean theory. So people are characterized whether they are more outgoing and open, or more extroverted or introverted, whether they are very conscientious and agreeable, or whether they are more conflictive people. And people are categorized in these personality traits, but also their preferences, tastes, and even weaknesses are profiled. And these weaknesses and vulnerabilities can be used by the platforms when they transfer or sell the data, for instance, to credit companies, because if someone is hardly needing money, they can then offer them very high interest rates, for instance. So these personality traits cannot only be categorized via your likes on Facebook or Instagram, but also even from how often you take your phone and respond to messages you receive. When you do it very often, you are more an extroverted person, or even somehow addicted to your device. And even the rhythm of your keyboard typing patterns can say something about your personality. So all your online behavior can be tracked through cookies and other invisible systems, and data can be collected about everything from searches and search patterns on Google, but also on pages you visited, and also your engagement on social media. And all of these data can be collected and is being collected. And there are lots of consumer data which are aggregated into digital profiles. So profiles about many things, and also these digital profiles can be used to meet consumer preferences. So, for instance, if you are on YouTube and they will know about your preferences for certain films, they will propose you a next film which you might like, or also ads you might like. So this can be used in a positive way in terms of increasing, let's say, preferences or well-being, but it can also be used to exploit vulnerabilities in terms of credits, in terms of housing. It can also be used to send you specialized information, which is fake information, and it can also be used for political manipulation. So it's really an ambiguous thing. And these commercial data brokers, I think they are also active in Brazil. They can aggregate profiles from many different sources, and then in that respect also collect information which is highly sensitive, for instance, when it comes to heart failure or other health conditions, or whether you had an abortion, or whether you have ever had access to drugs, illegal drugs, or whether you have a sexual orientation which is not corresponding to heterosexual norms and all that. And all this data, of course, can be used for positive purposes, but they can also be used against the users. So some people say these new business models in the internet and social media work along the saying, if you are not paying for the product, you are the product being sold. And many people have concerns about violations of privacy and clashes with human rights and civil liberties. So to sum up on the platform power of these companies, they have a high market value, a large user base, they dominate the market, they have high revenues and acquisition power, and this also leads to economic and political power, which can be used to lobby politicians and also for strategic litigation in courts. But there are also counter movements to these dominance of platforms, and also movements which aim at preserving democracy. So I think there is now a turn towards more digital regulation. In Europe, for instance, these are some quotes that a French economy minister said: "We don't want to be a digital colony of the US internet giants, and what's at stake is our sovereignty itself." So Europe especially is searching for a third way. And also consumers say, we want our privacy back. And protection of data has become something like a very important legislation. And there are regulations in the European Union, but also in other parts of the world. As you might have known, there is in Europe the so-called General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which entered into force in 2018, and it has enforced some principles about informed consent, data minimization, purpose limitation, and data safety. So people have the right to get information about which data is stored about them, and also to correct and delete certain data. Europe has also enforced the right to be forgotten and data portability requirements. And the data protection authorities have gained enhanced enforcement powers. And what's very special about GDPR is also that the sanctions can be very harsh. They can sum up to 4% of the total worldwide annual turnover. So Europe is considered to have the most strong data protection regime as compared to the US and China. And as you can see, Europe is not the only one. I think the GDPR has become something like the baseline for data protection all over the world, and more than 140 countries now have a general data protection legislation, 93 of them with special authorities for data protection. And in Latin America, data protection in many countries also has gained the status of being a constitutional right. And you know better than myself, I think, that Brazil has also enforced the General Data Protection Law, the LGPD. And it's now, I think, in August of this year, so last month, it started to be enforceable. I think this is a very important move, and I would like, in my stay in Brazil next year, know more about how it is being enacted in practice. And it's not only Brazil and other countries, but also China, which in August of this year has passed a new personal data protection law, which will take effect in November of this year. So this seems to be a more general move to give data protection and privacy back to the citizens. And a second turn is also competition policy, which is now striking back to restrict the power of large online platforms. As you might know, in the United States, there is now even a lot of talk about breaking up big tech companies. So in terms also of the Federal Trade Commission, they have set into place lots of inquiries about Google and about Facebook. And there is also even a discussion whether Facebook should sell WhatsApp and Instagram in order to be not so powerful in the social media arena anymore. And also Europe is taking on these tech giants and is now has several proposals on the table. One of them is the so-called Digital Services and Digital Market Act. And the idea of these acts is that they want to cut off these large droves of data collection and make these fisher nets available to other companies, especially to small and medium enterprise companies. So in that respect, to restrict the monopolies and to open the data troves up to others. China is now also launching a lot of attacks on big companies like TikTok, like Tencent and other platforms. And it also widens to Alibaba. So there seems to be the same move even in China. And in Europe, we also have another legislative proposal, which is called the Data Governance Act, which aims at facilitating data sharing from both public bodies, from the state, from private companies, and also from individual citizens. And Europe also aims at so-called European data spaces, also in terms of creating more forms of data sharing and data exchange. Another proposal is that companies should open up their data to others, and some people even say that very large online platforms should be forced to mandatory data sharing. And there are also proposals in Europe about the regulation of artificial intelligence. As you might know, there are now lots of ethics guidelines for AI, which are authored by many actors, for instance, the OECD, by the European Commission, by many governments, but also by expert actors and by private actors like private companies. The idea is that artificial intelligence should be used in a way which is human-centric and which is trustworthy, which respects human rights, and which also acts fairly. So the European Union aims at the regulation of high-risk AI systems to prevent violations of fundamental human rights and discrimination. And at present, for instance, we have a lot of debate about whether facial recognition in public spaces is to be prohibited or not. So high-risk AI systems are to be put under social and political control. So the European Union might be seen as a front runner, but I'm sure that also other forces, digital rights organizations in Brazil and in other countries want to do something about maintaining fundamental rights also in the digital arena and about really safeguarding our fundamental rights. So in terms of democratic governance of platforms, the European Union definitely pursues a regulatory model for the digital transformation to enhance not only its international competitiveness, but also to safeguard fundamental rights and data protection, to protect competition in digital markets, to become a trustworthy source of digital and AI services, and also to become a reference model for other countries. And other countries seem to be on the same track. And I would like to discuss with you now whether you think this is a worthwhile move or whether you have some criticisms about that. So I thank you very much for your attention and will now stop sharing my slides and ask also for you to hopefully be able to see me again and not my slides. And I think this seems to be working. I think.
Yeah, it's working. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you for your lecture. It was definitely very enlightening and inspiring and intriguing. Thinking about the dominance of these corporate superpowers and the huge amount of data they have access to, their ability to influence the world, and what can we do with and how exposed we are. This is very, very, very interesting. Well, we have some questions here. I think maybe you have already talked a little about these the things, but it would be interesting if you could answer. The first one: considering the ability of these platforms to grow in terms of users and to concentrate economic power, would it be possible to think of a global regulation of the use of data, or maybe a global only unique regulation to the whole companies to concentrate power, economic powers, and so on? Or we have to be these differences in how countries regulate their companies and so on?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great question. I think it would, of course, be good to have something like an international convention, United Nations convention on that. But at present, I think it's highly improbable to have that. So what I see, however, is there is a lot of movement with regards to AI ethics. For instance, the UNESCO is also presenting something like a proposal for having something like an AI ethics convention or something like a general framework. And there are also other, let's say, not companies, but the IEEE, for instance, is also having has proposals for regulating the ethics of AI. So in that respect, I think there is a move towards more international consensus. But in terms of competition law, in terms of data protection law, I think we would be much better off if we had, for instance, in the United States, a general data protection law. But as yet, there isn't something like that. It's just in the state of California and some other states, but we have gained now finally a little bit of data protection law. But I don't see that in the United States in the current legislative period, this will happen. So we will be somehow set back in that respect and have to trust to, let's say, regions or individual countries passing those laws. Okay, next question.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, analyzing the current scenario, do you believe that in the long run, social media will continue to damage democracy?
I mean, if
question,
I'm a pessimistic person, maybe yes. But I think social media is not just social media. It also is our own practices of, for instance, passing on, retweeting, or liking things which you haven't really read. If you had read only the title of certain things and just pass it on because it sounds catchy, of course, we ourselves contribute to the spread of fake news and disinformation. So it's not just blaming social media platforms, but maybe also blaming ourselves. And I think also in terms of digital self-defense, we can also decide not to use WhatsApp, for instance, anymore, but to use Telegram or Signal or other platforms. And it's not only on the platforms, but also our behavior, which has to be questioned and interrogated, I think.
Okay. Okay. We have some responsibility about those things too, right? And how to use it. And there is another question in regarding to that. That is, we have seen over the past years, not only in Brazil, but in other countries too, politicians or very known people using their social media accounts to spread fake news. What do you think about taking down these accounts? Do you agree with that, or what do you think about that?
I think the most, of course, particular example is Donald Trump, which was banned from Facebook finally after the storming the Capitol. And yeah, I think all of you know about these events of 6th of January this year. I think it came very late, so to speak. And I think, of course, removing someone who is a democratically elected leader of a country is a very difficult thing in terms of freedom of speech, in terms of democracy as well. But I think, for instance, what Twitter did was flagging fake news and saying this doesn't correspond, this has been checked and it's not the truth. I think this is a good practice. And for instance, in Germany now, we also have people denying the existence of COVID-19, and some of those people and groups of people have been removed now from some platforms or from YouTube. And I think this can be legitimized, but removing a democratically elected leader, I think, would go too far. But there should be other measures taken.
Okay. And we have the time is almost over, but we have one more that I would really listen from you. Is it possible to guarantee that data protection laws are really efficient? And I think that's the most important part. It will be able to evolve following the fast and growing technological development and the power of these companies, how they can spread their power and their concentration of users and so on. Do you think these data protection laws can evolve in this direction?
In that respect, I'm more optimistic. I think it's very good laws. I think also that they have gained international, something like an international spread. I think it's a very good movement, but of course they can only be positive if they are really enforced. And in Europe, we have made the experience that the Irish Data Protection Agency, which is responsible for the GAFAM companies, because they have their European seat mostly in Ireland, is very hesitant to punish them. So if those laws are only on paper and not in practice, I think this will be a drawback. But there is a lot of discussion right now about enforcement of data protection law, and we have moved on in this direction, I think. But I'm positive. I think the law is good. But of course, laws can only be as powerful as they are enforced by powerful agencies as well.
Okay, thank you. I think we are coming to the end of our webinar. So I would really like once again to thank Professor Ingrid for her excellent lecture and answers. Thank you. It was a pleasure to have you here, and it's also a pleasure to know that in 2022 you'll be here with us at EBAPE as our guest researcher. So you're welcome again. And we still have I think 2 minutes or so for your final remarks. So if you want to say something.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. And I'm looking forward to really having the opportunity of having hopefully a face-to-face communication with you once I will be in Brazil next year. And I really hope that we can continue our conversation. And I would really very much like to listen about your perspectives on social media, on platforms, because Brazil is a huge country, a very powerful, rising country. And I think you also made some experiences with disinformation, with fake news and other forms of more negative developments. And I'm sure you're very much concerned, as I am concerned, about democratic developments. So let's really continue our conversation. And thanks a lot. It has been a pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So at last but not least, I'd like to thank all of you from our audience who were here with us today and for asking questions and, of course, contributing to enhance our webinar even more. Now, Professor Ingrid, if you don't mind, I'll speak Portuguese again.
Of course. Go on. Muito obrigado.
Thank you. Obrigado. Bom, acho que é isso. Vamos ficando por aqui. Obrigado a todos pela participação, pela presença, por estarem aqui. Lembrando sempre que a gravação desse webinar vai ficar disponível tanto no YouTube quanto no LinkedIn, nos canais da FGV. Então, se vocês quiserem acessar de novo, verem, retomarem alguma coisa, gostaram, conhecem alguém que não pôde ver hoje ao vivo, mas que queira ver posteriormente, indiquem, estará lá disponível para todos. Muito obrigado e se cuidem. A gente se vê. Saúde.
Saúde.